You can vote at age 18, but no one seems to do that. You can vote at age 100. Everybody who's 100 seems to vote. We could take them all together, expected voters, and then try to think about where the average voter is. And again, being completely abstract about it, imagine that people vote the way they're expected to given their age. The median voter is at about 50 years old in the United States. Well, that means that the median voter, if you can picture her, she also expects to be dead by the time climate change disaster comes around. Because even if the climate change occurs, even if the disaster occurs in 2075, which is maybe the mean of all these predictions, that's some, 60-something years away from now, and the 50-year-old doesn't expect to live that long, even with technological change. So she doesn't care, and in a sense, we could finish the talk right now. That could be a really simple talk. You could just say, if the puzzle is, why don't we do anything about climate change? There's these good investments we ought to be making as a society. The answer might be, it's an answer many of us have thought of before, but the answer might be, the problem is the median voter. The problem is that society as a whole may think this is a good investment, but the median voter thinks, well, what do I care? I'll be gone, I'll be dead, long dead in fact, even my children will probably be dead. So I don't really care about the Earth going into the sea if there's any sea left in 2100, it's not my problem. And then we can stop right there and bemoan. In fact, that is what some writers do. We could bemoan the problem of long horizons, that politicians and even voters don't really care that much about what happens long in the future. They can't think that far. Usually the argument is in Dick Posner's book on catastrophe, is about politicians. It said, well, they care about maybe the next 4 years, 2 years, 10 years. I mean, they have some horizon. And if terrorism might strike within the next few years, therefore, the president really cares about terrorist threats. But things that might go wrong, like tsunamis that are expected to strike 1 in 100 or 1 in 300 years, the probability of it striking when this politician is in office or can be blamed for the harm is really much, much lower. So you should expect a rational politician to care more about terrorist threats than about, say, equally destructive or valuable, or whatever word you want to use, tsunami threats. And that's the sort of the running theme of the Posner book. All right, when will our median voter care? By the year 2040, she might care. Depends what you think of her children and grandchildren thing. But even then, 2040, 2050, she's pretty old. She might think to herself, well, it's in 2040, picture a 50-year-old. The 50-year-old in 2000, it's an ugly thought, but in 2040, because who knows what we'll be wearing then and all that. But if you picture this 50-year-old in 2040, she thinks, by the time I'm 77, or certainly 85 or 90, there's a real good likelihood of catastrophe. This assumes we haven't done anything between now and 2040. So that median voter in 2040 might say, it's time to take precautions. Let's get on that steep curve and invest now. I wish they had invested back in 2008. They didn't. It's time to hurry up. Even then, maybe not care that much. Because I could imagine that, and I could imagine thinking in 2040, well, I can either lead a much lower standard of living life for another 20-odd years, or 30 years, or I can lead, a better life for 35 or 45 years. And I can imagine the 50-year-old median voter in 2040 saying, I don't know, I'd rather lead a good life until age 75, and then the planet will burn, or whatever will happen to it. And that might be much better than severe precaution taking, which if it comes as a shock in 2040 would probably amount to quite a jar in the standard of living. So again, I don't want to really mess with that today. I'll just say, I think we can agree that if we do nothing, and if the projections are right, then in the year 2060, the median voter will really, really care. Now disaster will be either 15 years away on some studies, or say even a little longer than that away on other studies, 40 years away on other studies, but I'll go with the 2075 prediction, since that seems to be the current average. When I started writing this project, the year 2100 was the year people were holding out. But if it's 2075, I think the median voter in 2060 will really, really, really care. So that's step 2. You might say, it's a shame we could take more modestly expensive steps now and solve climate change problems as best we can if we start now. We ought to do that as a socially optimal thing if we take all generations together. But given that the center of power is with this median voter in democracy that the politicians are responsive to, young voters are being overwhelmed by older voters. The older voters don't care. But you know, the planet will not sink into oblivion, because in the year 2040, the median voter will finally care a lot about the coming catastrophe. Then the median voter will vote to take steps. Then the planet will be saved. They'll just all moan, and they'll say, it's really too bad, because if only they had started in 2008 or 1990, it'd be so much less painful to make the change, and you get where I'm going. It's going to get faster, so maybe I should just speed up now. All right, next step, and I think here's the critical step. That's not the right way to think about it. Because I think the right way to think about it is, if it's true that in 2060, let's say, people who are then 60 years old will surely, you know, the 50-year-old's going to start voting for climate change. The 60-year-olds are going to be, people are going to be pointing at them and saying, you're to blame. When you were the median voter 10 years ago, you should have started change faster. We have no sympathy for you. You're part of the problem. So first of all, we need to take steps right now. And second of all, this is very expensive for our society, and we're not giving you any tax breaks. You are going to pay enormous taxes in order to start taking these changes. Again, I'll call everything taxes, though I realize there are other things that it might be. It might be a lower standard of living. It might be nobody can drive a car. But let's just make believe that it could all be solved by the government spending money to take it all into one metric. Well, knowing in the year 2040, or I know I'm getting my years mixed up, but you know, knowing in 2040 that in 2050 the median voter will start taking expensive steps, and expensive steps will mean raising taxes a great deal. 10 years before that, the median voter might say, well, I don't really care about climate change, but I really care about climate change-induced tax change, you might call it. In other words, the catastrophe I face is not that I will live in a city that will go into the sea. That will happen after I die. But the catastrophe I worry about is that I will spend a good part of my adult life spending everything and living a very low standard of living so that the people who come after me will not fall into the sea. I'm willing to avoid that. And then once you see that, you can see the iterative process working backwards, that when the median voter begins to care about what later median voters will do and how much it will affect the first median voter's lifestyle, then median voters will start doing things to avert climate change in order not to be in a position where everybody blames them and taxes them in order to get more expensive changes later on. All right, that's an important step. You sort of have that idea? So it's not as bad as it looks. It's very bad, but it's not as bad as it looks. It's like the theme of every movie. It looks terrible, music, but it's not quite as bad as it looks, because at some point people will get rational because they'll realize that they'll be held to blame or made to pay. Therefore, we can iterate backwards, if that's a verb, a little bit. And you know, a hyper-rational person might go iteratively backwards all the way to today, though I don't want to go there for reasons that will become clear. But the idea is that we might start things a little bit earlier as median voters care about this. Now, what do you notice about this? First, tax law matters a lot. You know, right now, in most of these countries, certainly the United States, most of what the money we raise, most of the burdens we impose are through the income tax system. But it need not be so, and it's not so in every country. And if I don't really care that much about what happens after I'm age 70, because I figure I'm going to pay low taxes then one way or the other, I might care a lot more if we were staying on a national sales tax or a value-added tax or something else. Because I got to tell you, I don't really expect to retire ever, but I do know that if I do retire, I then expect to consume. That is, I'm also not going to go into much. Indeed, I'll probably take more vacations and play more golf and do other fun things. So it might be that one way they can get me to pay will be to switch from an income tax to a value-added tax somewhere between now and then. Now, I don't want to make this a lunch about tax policy, but you see where this is going. This could be true of everything. It's always true that at any point in the intergenerational bargain, the younger voters could vote to change from an income tax to a value-added tax. That would suddenly break the social compact if you did not have transition rules. Older voters would say, oh, wait a minute. I paid income taxes, you know, from age 25 when I first became an associate at a law firm, all the way to age, you know, 66 when I retired. And I did all that at high rates, taking into account all the benefits I would enjoy from age 66 to 86. It's not fair for you now to switch to a value-added tax that you collect more or less evenly from people between age 26 and 86. This is a regular social problem about transition rules and switching. And maybe the reason we don't find these switches or constitutional amendments to forbid it is that it's an uneasy social bargain and nobody wants to open this Pandora's box. And there may be reasons for it. But if we suddenly needed trillions of dollars to effect a climate change policy, it would be quite plausible, especially if everybody was blaming, if you guys blame the finger, point the finger at me and blame my generation for not having taken steps right now, it's much more plausible that you'll feel it's perfectly okay when Levmore is 65 to switch from an income tax to a value-added tax in order to put much more of the burden on his generation, which went around driving their Range Rovers and Hummers as if there was no tomorrow while we were all screaming, recycle, recycle, drive smart cars. And that could well be, and that might happen, and that's part of the game. There are a lot of ways to do this. It could be specific taxes. I mean, not a tax on movies, because young people like movies. It could be a carbon tax or a gas tax. As you may know, some of you went to another lunch where I talked about what we might gain from having less of an income tax and much more of an oil tax or gas tax or something of the sort. That might be a very good idea. Whatever it is, you need to think about the generational effect in all these taxes. This is a traditional way to do this, which is tax, right? Borrowing money. That's a traditional way when young people want schools and old people say, I don't care about schools anymore because I never learned anything there, and besides, I don't have kids who are school age anymore. The typical thing that young people do when they move to the new suburb is they say, fine, let's issue bonds and we'll pay back these bonds over 20 or 25 years. And that way, those of us who are going to enjoy the schools will pay more than the presumed share of the cost of these schools. And then older voters say, oh, maybe wrongly they say, oh, okay, I'm not sure what the effect of my property values is, but at least I understand the concept that if you build a bridge or build a school and you pay it off over the expected length of the life of the school or the bridge, maybe that's a fair way to pay for it. And presumably you could do the same thing with climate change. Old people would say to young people, I don't care about climate change. You do? Okay, I'll start climate change policy, but you pay for it. And the way you'll pay for it is we will issue bonds and we'll pay for that over a long period of time. The problem is that right now, the long period of time would be 80 years, maybe rather than 20 years. We have very little experience with borrowing of that length. Young people don't like, surveys suggest that young people don't like long-term borrowing. Old people don't like borrowing at all. Young people don't like long-term borrowing. Part of it is uncertainty. The more rational part might be that you, as young people, you think money is too cheap if we can borrow it. If my generation, that is the median voter, said, let's borrow trillions and trillions and trillions and build undersea villages that will be there in case the enemy attacks or something, you guys would roll your eyes and say, you know, that's the problem with borrowed money that they want us to pay back when we're law firm partners. I mean, they just overspend. These are not really cost-justified Atlantises in the sea. They're just spending on crazy projects because the money is too cheap. And you'd be right about that. That is, it's hard for politicians to think correctly about the expenditure, and maybe even voters to do so, if they don't have to really spend the money themselves. So, one lesson from this is that the world that we live in is an unsurprising world. Right? Once you think about the median voter, it's unsurprising because, sure enough, right now, movies are more popular, people are beginning to care about climate change. In surveys, it rises a little bit. It used to be that everybody cared about crime, the economy. Now, you know, those are a little bit lower, economy's still up there. Climate change has slowly but surely risen in people's and voters' minds. That's the important issue of the day. Some of it is more information, I grant you, but some of it also is, it's more pressing. It's now, you know, 70 years away from some expected catastrophe rather than 90 years away from some catastrophe. And as the median voter ages, you should expect the median voter ages in the sense of the gap between that and catastrophe, you should expect the median voter to care a little bit more about climate change and about calls to action. Again, I think this makes much more sense if you see it not as that I care about climate change, but more as that I care about climate change-induced tax change. I don't want to be made to pay for it and have all my older years be led in poverty. You might say that democracy is like a teenager. I don't mean that only democracy is like a teenager. I just finished reading this great, chilling biography of Mao, which some other people in the room may have read or listened to. or kindled or whatever we do these days. And Mao was also like a teenager, really didn't seem to care about what happened 20 years later. He didn't seem to care about anything after his own death, really. So Mao also had a pretty short time horizon. I don't mean to blame democracies as, the only ones that have it, but democracies have pretty short time horizon. Like your average 15-year-old. They can really see that playing a game now would be fun. They can see that maybe they ought to do something now in order to get something in a month, maybe in a year. That's pretty short way of thinking. There are very, very few, teenagers that say, ooh, I was thinking of saving more money now so that I would have money for my retirement. And that's kind of an unheard of thing. And even getting a teenager to study a foreign language that might be useful much later on is hard to do. That seems to be the role of the middle-aged person, is to tell the younger person how to extend their time horizon a little bit. And it may be for politician reasons or voter reasons that democracies are a lot like that. Anticipating some of the questions you'll ask when I finally wind down, which I'm not doing yet, you might say, well, wait a minute. If rules were fixed, if tax rules were fixed, and we had pure Coasian bargains, it really shouldn't matter where the median voter is. That is, it should always be true that young people can say to old people, we really need to invest in climate change now. It's socially efficient investment. By Levmore's example, it'll return 15% or more. We ought to do it. Look, if you guys are going to use your power to vote to block this, we'll pay you to do it. We'll promise you lower tax rates. We'll give you money. We'll give you Medicare. Whatever it takes. Let's have a Coasian bargain. That's right. In some perfect transaction cost-free world, there should be constant bargains among generations. But it's not surprising that they don't happen. There's incredible uncertainty. There's the uncertainty about what you need and when you get it and its cost. There's uncertainty about the tax rules. Once people see that you can change the tax rules, you'll worry that when you get old, people will change the tax rules on you and make you pay for everything for the previous 100 years, the next 1,000 years. There's almost no end to it. So it's very, very tricky to try to shape some of these non-fixed rules, like what the tax base of the country is. Almost everybody who proposes moving from an income tax to a value-added tax promises transition rules. Oh, let's give relief to the people who will be hurt, i.e. older people mostly, from this transition. So when so many moving parts, the bargaining is tough, I guess that's the way I wrote it down to myself. And what about internationally? And now I begin to see another piece of fun. So, the standard argument against investing in climate change is to say, well, why should we go to great expense or suffer if really it won't accomplish very much because India and China won't do that, to pick two obvious counterparts. And then either they will just increase their effluence or whatever we think they'll do, or we'll lose our competitive position so the cost will be higher. You're familiar with all these arguments. And that may be right, and I think presidential candidates ought to be addressing that, and we can talk about that later if you like. But what does this tell us about all that? I think it tells us something very interesting. India is really the best example. You see, an added complication is that India is much younger than we are. I don't mean the date of their independence. I mean the age of their population. So, and all more so in 2040. So, our average age, I wrote down some statistics, in our median age now is 36. Our actual median voter is between 45 and 50, depending on the election and who turns out. But if our median age is 36, the median age in Europe is, I think, now between 40 and 41. I wrote down India. The median age in India is, anybody want to guess?
25.
Sorry?
25.
25 is exactly correct. The median age in Rwanda? Oh, Uganda. That's the lowest.
22.
15. So, median ages really vary around the world. The median age of Japan, it's like 100 something. The median ages really vary. And, the median voter to median age gap is not always the same if you think about it, not because of voting ages. But, more or less add 7 to 10 years to figure out the median age of the voter. Though, if the median age is 15 and the voting age is 18 or 21, you got to add a bigger gap than that. But you can see the idea. Well, our negotiations with Japan are very different from our negotiations with India. It's not the most important thing there, but it's there a little bit. India, in the long run, will care much more about climate change than Japan will, because the median voter in India will more quickly be there when the place sinks. It's also true that India is likely to suffer more from climate change, as you know from general newspaper reading, the agricultural sector where it's located, the effect of a few degrees temperature and all that. So India is like a prime customer for us to negotiate with because they will be young. That's great for us. It's hard to negotiate with an old country. Now, it's a little bit easy to negotiate with an old country, only in the sense that we might say to them, go along with us in reducing your carbon, but don't worry about the cost. Come on, you know, you're old. You can pass it on to the young people in Japan. And I guess that is one argument you can make to an old country about their internal politics. But I think most of us would rather we were talking to somebody who was young and cared about climate change more than who was old and didn't really care about climate change except as a second or third removed effect. China's trickier. Right now it's younger than we are, but because of their slow population growth, that is, or maybe even negative population growth, by the year 2040, China will be about our age, and by the year 2050, China will actually be a little older than we are. So China's a tricky situation here. And again, I don't mean to make this the major effect. The primary effect, I think, is the one I've already discussed. A secondary effect is that at the international cooperation level, you need to begin to think about the age profile of the populations. So let me sum up, and then let's do questions. Disaster can be overcome by intergenerational bargains. I'm convinced of that, and the whole talk stands on that. But it's hard. It's like, I didn't do the math, so I may be off by orders of magnitude, but it's like saying, what if we knew that to have the decent standard of living, we needed now to build 10,000 Golden Gate bridges? You know, we need to make an enormous investment. You know, how good would we be at working that out between young people and old people, people who thought the roads were crumbling, not thought the roads were crumbling? I mean, that's an enormous investment, and if it needs to be done, as it probably does in the case of climate change, either by reduction in standard of living or expenditures or water systems or energy substitutes or whatever you think it is, it's like building more bridges than you've ever seen, which can be done, but it's a substantial intergenerational bargaining process. One way to mediate this is through the tax system. A lot of it hangs on who pays. Right now we have a stable system, and it might be that one way to think about tinkering with it is to think that you want a tax system that matches up with either who caused the problem, if you think you can do that, or who will benefit from the problem. Probably we're at an advantage. Probably because we have an income tax, we are more inclined to vote for steps that countries that rely much more on value-added tax are inclined, right? In a value-added tax country, if it's old, think about an old value-added tax country. You know, that country expects the old people to pay more through their value-added taxes paid in retirement, and yet those people are biased towards the median voter, and they don't care as much about climate change. You know, that's serious. I think they would wish they were in an income tax for this purpose. But always beware that we can switch to a value-added tax in order to lay blame or in order to be in this intergenerational bargain. That's maybe the only thing that should worry us about a gas tax. Borrowing might be a solution. And finally, I guess I would say, well, we should be grateful that at least internationally that problem is probably smaller than we think. Because when we're ready to do deals, we'll be bargaining with countries, at least one important country, maybe two, that are significantly younger than we are. And that's probably a good thing if I'm right about the initial claim that when push comes to shove, the age horizon, or age profile of the voters will. So why don't we stop there and, as is our tradition, spend half the time on questions and responses. If I had known that clapping was the convention, I would have finished with some rousing final line. And so I say to you, we can solve the problem.
In the second part of your talk, where you're talking about international ages of countries, what effect is it that, say, India, the age of death is probably on average much lower than it is here? I mean, yeah, they're younger, but they're still not going to be around in 70 years because they don't live as long.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I wish I had said that. I'll repeat the question. The question is, oh, wait a minute. Some of these countries that are young, indeed almost invariably, the Ugandas and the Indias of the world, also have lower life expectancies. And so they may be younger, but they don't expect to be there in 2075, or they shouldn't expect to be there in 2075. Yeah, I should have taken that into account, meaning I should have limited my comparison, say, to China, UK, Japan, US for now. Although I think India, not Uganda, is a good example. So mortality statistics catch up very, very, very fast. So in 1960, Mexico was much younger than even we were. And now, you want to guess? I mean, do you know anything about, now basically the same life expectancy. It's infinitesimally short, a couple of years, and the gap is narrowing. So, with reasonable changes, that is, once a country is stable and has clean water, a few other things, the life expectancies change dramatically and very, very, very quickly. So, almost any country that we would care to deal with about the things that went into climate problems, it's really about energy policy and about a few other things. As soon as they have enough of an industrial base or consumer base to do that, they probably also have life expectancy that is approaching ours, or we, of course, not the highest life expectancy, or even, about ours. So we're just in the middle of the life expectancy story, despite all our expenditures. So we actually might be in a good example. It does make Japan even more striking. They're older than we are, for your example. They're older than we are, but they also expect to live longer. So maybe I shouldn't be counting Japan as really old, just because they're 5 to 7 years older than we are. They expect to live 2 to 3 years older than we are. The gap's not as great as it appears. Another interesting thing about that, now that you bring it up, is we also ought to look at retirement ages if we think who pays the taxes really matters. Japan has a much younger retirement profile than we do, even younger than Europe does, and much younger than Mexico does. So Japan, really, it's a whole different analysis. The median voter is quite old, by comparison. They expect to live a little longer, but between median voting and age of retirement is only a few years. So that median voter is a really powerful guy. I mean, that's a place where we might expect to see some equivalent of a constitutional amendment or a change in basic law locking in the tax system. Because those guys are really worried that the tax system will be flipped on them, and in their old age, they will suddenly be expected to pay much higher value-added taxes, and their counter-younger parts will expect lower. But your point's well taken. If I had a pen, I'd write it down. But perhaps you could email me or mention it. Yeah, behind you. Hi.
Hi. You talked a lot about sort of whole response to climate change depending on the whims of the median voter. And then for China, how it might be complicated because of the shifting age of median voting. Could sort of that problem sort of be matched on the other side, that perhaps the whims of the median voter don't mean as much to policy in China as they do in the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm ready for yours. So let's see, let me repeat the question. The question says, well, aren't you a little too obsessed with the median voter? First of all, maybe the median voter has these whims, so I'm going to object to that word. But then I think the more serious part of the question, the harder part of the question is, it's a little funny to talk about the median voter in China where elections are at such a nascent stage. Well, what's the evidence, you might say, that the leaders really are responsive to the median voter as opposed to something else? And why fixate on the median voter in China of all places? Is that fair? So first of all, take back the word whims. You said it 3 times. Come on. It's not the whims of the median voter any more than it's the whim of General Motors to try to make money. It's sort of their self-interest. And I think as a first cut, we usually think that the self-interest of a voter or an economic player or a politician is probably the most important thing to know, though there might be other things to know. Right? The median voter, is somebody who isn't going to be around. I don't recycle as much as you do, I bet. True? Are you a recycler?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really care. I care a little bit. I'm skeptical. I recycle when people are watching. I'm trying to get it's hard to get worked up about it. And I'm sure that if I lived in Montana and I was a fly fisherman, I would recycle more. It would be more obvious to me what the costs of the pollution were. I'm sure if I were young, it's not an accident that young people are more into environmental stuff. I think there's a lot of evidence about that. So, let's not call it whim. Let's call it self-interest. Your point about elections is quite right. I am assuming, for purposes of writing a shorter paper or book, I am assuming that China will eventually have elections and care a lot about the median voter, and that that's the right way to think about the future there. It may be wrong, It may be that we should think about societies that are responsive to what exactly? To the median age of interest groups, the median age of the most important workers. You know, it's not clear. It's clear that the leadership of China is responsive to somebody. I mean, you'd run the country a lot differently if all you cared about was maximizing the size of your castles or something. You know, they're not living in castles. So they care about something. It's for long-term stability with something. You know, it's hard to generalize even about the countries we know best. You know, what are our politicians doing? You know, it's not obvious always. But as a first cut, I think responsive to the median voter is fair. It may be that if you don't think elections matter that much in China, then they are more responsive to median age. That's fine, since median age correlates, for obvious reasons, almost perfectly with median voter. And that's okay too. The age profile will still matter. So all I need to get you to agree is that if China were very, very old, say the median age in China was 59, or China was very, very young, say the median age was 17, won't you agree that the leadership would react very, very differently towards climate change problems thought to be catastrophic in Shanghai, say in the year 2067? I think the answer is just got to be yes. I mean, in one case, they would worry about huge insurrections and economic dislocation because there'd be a whole population growing up realizing that their industrial base is going to be underwater if they don't do anything about it. In the other setting, they respond to this entire population who really don't give a hoot and worries about only maybe their children and grandchildren, and you know, their standard of living is so likely to be higher than the people who are now 59 that it's hard to believe they get all worked up about it. So even if we didn't expect elections, I feel pretty comfortable saying age matters. Yep.
It seems possible that, you know, before any expected catastrophe date, there'd be,
Before any,
like the date of an expected catastrophe at 2075, that it would be maybe 20 or 25 years in front of that where there might be a point of no return, since these solutions will probably take some time to implement. So might there be the possibility that, you know, before 2051, we would have to, you know, set the path to solve these problems, that there would never be a time before then when the median voter would care about this?
you're in the movie business, because I see it coming. Yeah. So the question, if I could paraphrase it just a little bit, is maybe an asteroid will hit us before climate change. I mean, is that sort of the question?
No, it's that, let's
Meaning
say,
we won't care.
no, I think what I'm saying is that maybe, you know, to reverse climate change might take like 20 or 30 years, and so that's another 20 or 30 years of people before our point of no return date that plan on not being alive anymore when catastrophe hits.
Okay, well, maybe you read different science magazines than I do, but I don't think anybody thinks there's a point of no return. There's a point of huge costs, and of course that's not a point. I mean, it's a curve, and I'm just exaggerating it a little bit to make the analysis easier. You know, that if there's catastrophe, I mean, say temperatures rose 8 degrees rather than 2 degrees. We wouldn't all disappear, but we would have massive relocation to areas that are now cooler or maybe even too cold to live in. Lots of our infrastructure would be wasted. I mean, there'd be enormous costs, but it's not a matter of disappearing. Now, it might be that you think that with enough climate change, no government would be stable. That as an intergenerational bargain really wouldn't matter because it would all fall apart if, you know, 100 million people had to relocate to the Yukon. And they just wouldn't go there and then say, oh, continue as before. There's my state legislator walking down the street. You know, they say, whoa, all bets are off, and it's like Road. You read that novel?
No.
Oh, well, you guys march down the middle of the road, you know, killing everything in sight, and an old guy like me, you know, hides in the woods and, you know, all that. I mean, it might be a totally different society. So that, to me, might be a point of no return. I think that's a little extreme. I mean, more likely is that, you know, with 20 years warning, say we do nothing and all the projections are right. So then with 20 years warning, people would see that a couple cities are likely to disappear at some point. And they'll either go to great expense to build all sorts of walls, you know, the Netherlands style, or slowly but surely those cities will shrink and, you know, Minneapolis will become the booming place or something. You know, that's much more likely disaster scenario. I call it disaster because, you know, that will become the national obsession. It would be all of healthcare and all of national defense and all of space rolled into one big program. That would be very, very expensive to relocate, you know, the entire population. Much more expensive for China and India than for us, and that is what the projections show. You know, we're sort of a service economy, and lots of things can move around, and you know, finally we might be happy that we don't make anything anymore. You know, it might be good news. There's nothing to move. Or, better yet, the guys in Arizona will move back to Pittsburgh and fire up those old steel plants, and they'll be in the perfect location at that point. You know, who knows? But, you know, I think that's just a little bit much for me. Yep?
It seems like you were describing global climate change as a problem that's sort of discrete. As I'm thinking, a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas generating activities also generate air pollution that has immediate sort of health effects on the population, where coal power plants, for example. Is there any effect on generations that would have an immediate public or health effect to greenhouse gas generation?
Yeah, that's very interesting. The question is, leaving aside climate change catastrophe for a minute, and just think about environmental damage. Do age profiles matter for that, or is it intergenerational bargaining? I've only thought about this a little bit, and maybe there's a lot written about it that I don't know. I think the answer is sure, but it probably washes a lot. You know, old people care a lot more about bad air quality, right? If you live somewhere where they say, oh, the air quality is, you know, people at risk should stay indoors. That must be really bad news in Saratoga, Florida. You know, whereas for us, I don't know, I don't mean to pry into your health situation, but for us, it makes no difference at all. I just lead my normal life. And indeed, I find myself thinking, ooh, my run at the lake will be better today because I'll have to exert more energy. It'll be better exercise. This is efficient. You know, I don't know. On the other hand, you know, and you see where I'm going, old people care more about the immediate quality of the air because they might have more trouble breathing. But young people care more about the quality of the air because it signals what the environment is likely to look like or, you know, devolve into over their lifetime. So I'm not sure who ought to care more about that. I haven't really thought about it. It might be there's an answer, but I don't know.
I will just point, there is a recent mercury regulation in Illinois with regard to coal power plants that produce mercury, which has an effect on development of children, and so that it was...
Yeah, but it also has an effect on old people. They're brilliant.
It was a huge push by pediatricians.
Right. So that's right. There are some things that affect babies in utero. You know, in my hypothetical world, though it sounds ridiculous to say, old people don't give a hoot about it. I don't really believe it, but you know, in this hyper-rational world. But then there are other things that old people care about a lot more. You know, acid rain, you know, might really matter to them more. So I don't know the answer to that. Overall, it might have to do with specific things. Yep.
I guess I wonder about your notion of costs, and I'm neither an expert economist nor an expert in tax policy, so this may be a very lay understanding. But insofar as it requires all these adjustments and construction of 10,000 Golden Gate bridges, that's all economic activity, which stimulates economic growth and is a productive use of labor and will result in wages and things. So how far can we think of this as a cost, or just another, or refocusing or rechanneling of economic activity into different priorities than our current priorities, which are, we're building houses and roads. Now we're going to, build apartment buildings and mass transit systems.
Right. I like to think of myself as one of the most optimistic people on the planet. Certainly in this law school. In this law school, it's not hard to be the most optimistic. But boy, you really outdo me on every front. So the question, if I understand it, is, well, as long as you think that we can offset climate change with investments, shields or new water or plants that process, whatever it is that we'll do, air conditioners facing outward to cool the earth, whatever it is, those are all great. Because, although it looks like a cost, to every cost is benefits in that people will be at work, and they'll be making things, and they'll sing songs while making them. Labor unions will become re-energized, and there'll be all these great effects by whatever your politics are, though I think we know. Yeah. Oh, see, we know even more now. Well, okay, so yeah, that is a kind of little bit of an economics problem there. I think you have to believe, unless everything we know about life is crazy, you have to believe that if I am hired to dig a ditch and then fill it with dirt, to give the World War II and New Deal example that the president then talked about a lot, you have to believe that although there might be some benefits to that, it just can't be that those benefits come close to or exceed the costs. That is, it can't be that whenever we have a problem, oh, here's $100, just make a mess of that desk and then fix it. And the desk will be the same. Then we'll have $100, she'll spend it, it'll multiply through the economy, we'll be rich. We'll beat Sputnik.
Absolutely.
It can't be right.
So long as they're productive investments.
Right, but that's the question about the rate of return. We would rather not have to fix the desk. We would rather not destroy it in the first place, even though it's true that when we have to fix the desk at a cost of, say, $100, it's not exactly $100. The $100 is a complicated measurement because there might be other costs and benefits, externalities that flow out of that expenditure. More or less $100 captures the right price, but if you think it's a little higher or a little lower, fine. But you'd be much better off not damaging the desk in the first place and spending $100 on improving your standard of living rather than just putting it back where it was. So you don't want to have to build shields and air conditioners in the sky and all that if you can help it, but that is what we mean by the cost of global warming. We mean there are a lot of ways to deal with it. You could cut down on your gas now, you could do this, you could do that, or maybe you could build things like bridges and factories to reduce it. Maybe, you know, I'm trying to summarize all that in one statistic, but I think it's dangerous to think, wow, that's good news, because the massive expenditure will keep us happy. No, the massive expenditure will be an expenditure. You know, it will be a cost. It will not give us added pleasure compared to our baseline of where we are now, and it'll be expensive. It'll take the place of other things we wish we had. So it'll be very, very expensive. It'll be like putting you in a car accident and then healing you in the hospital. Yes, we can do it, and yes, a few doctors and nurses and manufacturers of equipment will be better off, but we will not be as well off as we were before we wrecked your body in the car accident. Believe that. Yeah.
So, I'm curious about how strong do you think this intergenerational bargaining sort of mechanism is compared to all the other mechanisms out there? I mean, you look at Europe, you say it's an older nation, yet they're doing the most of climate change. You look at trying to bargain between nations, and yes, maybe they like money, but they like to control more of the world instead. And is this sort of really be the situation that we're going to go apart, where there will be an intergenerational bargaining? People are like, all right, we fix things now. We'll be like, well, we'd love to do that, but even though we know there's going to be catastrophes in 20 years, we still have to worry about the Chinese nuking us or something in the intervening time.
Yeah, that's a great question. To repeat the question, it's, I think you're accepting the first part of the talk, that the age profile within the United States might matter a great deal in terms of median voter. But the objection is to the part that starts saying maybe it'll make international cooperation easier over there and harder over there based on their age profiles. And I agree that's a problem. Because the question is, you know, it's just hard to believe that's such a big effect. Maybe because they live longer in some places. It's hard to believe it's a big effect because, for example, if we look around the world at who seems to be doing the most sacrificing with respect to climate change now, it seems to be some countries in Western Europe. And they are exactly the ones that are old. So that seems a little odd. I mean, my talk would be a lot better if the Europeans were the ones driving Hummers and the Mexicans and the Ugandans were the ones recycling a lot. Then you would say, ooh, Levmore's really on to something. But this does seem a little backward, if you will. Well, that's right. I mean, that's why I leave it for the end. It's just a possibility. But I think the American effect is much more palpable. You know, first of all, not every country in Europe is doing something. I don't mean to insult anyone in the room. But, you know, Italians, for example, are a mess. I mean, they're polluting like crazy. Their footprints are awful, and yet they're really old. So, you know, there are examples every which way. It seems right now to be modest effects based on charismatic leaders or political coalitions. So I agree with you that the evidence is not great for my international point. There's no evidence that India cares a lot, yet they're young. Well, you know, they're probably thinking different discount rates. We're like China. We're better off having 5 or 10 years of rapid growth, and then the burden will be less if we deal with climate change. And that might be quite rational if you're leading China or India. So I'm with you. I think it's a very good point. It remains to be seen. I think it's an effect. You know, it might just be a few years of an effect. You know, just ask yourself the question of if you're the American sent to bargain with another country, say with India or China, and you're ready to really reach a deal. You guys take these steps, we'll do those steps, we'll make the whole planet better off. We'll eliminate the competitive argument between us. Would you rather their age profile were old, or would you rather their age profile were young? Or don't you care? You know, your question suggests you don't think you care. My talk suggests, I think you would rather the age profile were young. You know, maybe not, in which case it's a modest, you know, theoretical effect. I think it matters. Yeah.
I'm not entirely convinced by the extent to which we rely on the median voter. First of all, I think in the international context, you only do that as the median age for the population in general, not the voting population, right? And you didn't look at what extent of the population is actually participating in the political process, so that might have an influence. And also, I think you might need to look at the political systems in the different countries, like where do you have countries where the actual people could directly vote for a bill that implements some sort of climate change, I don't know, and where, I mean, for example, in the US, the voters themselves wouldn't actually make a difference, only the representatives. And then you always have the problem of, you know, political pressure and self-interest on their part. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure how the median voter is really perfect.
Okay, so it's a lot like the China question I got earlier, but the question is, you know, you're obsessed with the median voter, the whole paper hangs on the median voter, and I don't really think people have much to do with what happens anyway, and besides, the median voter might be different from the median age elsewhere in the world. Okay, I mean, you know, that's your view. I think they are responsive. The median voter does track the median age very, very closely for natural gap reasons. You know, I think there are hundreds, I mean, you're in a respectable group. There are a lot of people who think, median voter, it doesn't really matter. I think there are a lot of policies we could show each other around the world where our best explanation of inter-country differences, or especially changes within a country, have to do with what the median voter has come to believe. And I don't just mean median voter by age, but median voter by lots of things. So every country seems to think that if you have a big secession movement and a whole lot of the country lops off, that the domestic policy of the remaining part of the country will change. How about that? That's because they think the new median voter will be very different from the old median voter. And every country seems to think that if you take on another whole piece to your country, things will really change politically, no matter what your political system. Again, the median voter will change. You know, everybody seems to think that when China reabsorbed Hong Kong, that Chinese policy would in all sorts of ways change. It appears to have changed. These are all ways of saying that median voter is sort of one way to think about it. You could talk about it different ways, the responses to this pressure group or that. But Hong Kong, by the way, is amazingly old. But that's, you know, I think those are all related. But I accept that this really does depend on believing that a lot of politics is responsive to something about the population, which we're just trying to capture in this one metric called the median voter. It may be the wrong metric. But I don't know. I think it's too easy to say, oh, well, maybe participation is different, and who turns out to vote, and who votes. You know, I think by and large, you've got to talk in large terms. You know, it would be like, imagine if I did that with climate change, and I said, you know, cutting out on driving really isn't having anything to do with climate change. You know, there are some cars that really, you know, if I have a big car, I might actually drive it less than if I had a small car. Because, you would just say, you roll your eyes and come on. We got to deal in macros and policy. We can't have policy for each family. And as a macro level, one way to cut down on this is that. And I'm doing the same kind of thing with the voters. You seem so eager to get out tonight. You're not calling.
Well, what I was wondering was, as the issues of climate change and maybe other issues kind of become more prominent in the media, these issues that affect young people more, wouldn't that kind of turn out more young people to vote? Shift the median voter age down, or change the structure of the voting?
Right, so the good question is, although you'll be a little startled in my response, the good question is, ooh, I see another effect. It's a friendly question, actually. The good question is, as climate change becomes more important to young people, maybe young people will participate in voting more. Now, old people vote more than young people and all that. And so maybe that'll reduce the age of the median voter more. It's the opposite of the previous question. It says, I'm more obsessed with the median voter than you are. And you're, you know, the median voter gap is going to be greater, et cetera. Maybe that's fine. You know, that'd be great. I like to be right, so that would matter. You know, that matters to me more than climate change. You know, come on. But, you You know, here's a startling fact. It's very, very hard to come up with anything that a country does differently in a democracy. It's very hard to come up with anything that would have been different if more people had voted. It's just hard. You know, every study you see, say the United States has a notoriously low turnout rate compared to Europe. There's some people here in my public choice class that have seen more of this evidence. But you know, say you compare the United States and Australia. Australia with compulsory voting, and the United States with what seems to be like compulsory non-voting. You know, it's really hard to identify differences in policy or who's elected or what based on, oh, more people are voting. It's true that some of the people who don't vote are poor in the United States, but the people who vote the most are poor old people. So poor is a complicated thing. It's true that old people vote more than young people, but, you know, the rate of the population change of who's old and who's young probably has a bigger effect. It's just very hard. It's very hard to find anything. Our own Tom Miles, I think, if I remember the workshop, where I had a study in which, what if ex-felons who are now not allowed to vote could vote? What would happen? Yeah, really hard. You know, probably wouldn't make a difference. You tend to think of ex-felons as, whoa, they are all, you know, they have the same, you know, they're a certain age, they're a certain gender, you know. Most people who don't vote, if they vote, you know, they would sprinkle out in voting much more than we think. So I'm not so sure that it would make that much difference. I know that sounds contrary to my whole thing about the median voter, and I'd be happy if you were right. I think we have time for one more, and I feel like I ignored the sign. So I'm going to privilege a short question from the side. Is there? Yep.
Do you think it's easier to resolve the intergenerational gap if you use the necessary action to change in corporate practices rather than individual conduct? So do you think instead of forcing people not to drive or to move or to change their standards to the course of the agriculture industry to choose the way does business or the auto industry need to change because of people learn to drive?
So the very hard question is, do I think that bargaining would be easier? Not would it be better, but would the bargaining be easier or different if we thought not about policies that focus at the consumer level, but thought about policies that focus at the corporate level? Now, say we went about it telling factories what to do or agribusiness what to do. Would that make it easier? I don't know the answer, but I do promise to think about it. Let me just tell you why I don't know the answer. I think I see where you're going, which might be, so a college student, a young voter, might be much more likely to think that a problem will go away or be exported if you just tell Microsoft what to do. And it might be that it's only as we age or as we become skeptical or as we go to law school that we start thinking, you know, Microsoft is a they, not an it, it's its shareholders, its consumers, and telling Microsoft what to do affects the employees and the workers. You know, it's not obvious that you can just order big companies around and think that somehow it's somebody else's costs. And that the incidence analysis question. So I think the gist of your question is that maybe young people would be more inclined to think that if it's exported, then they're not at stake. Is that what you have in mind? So I need to think about that. That might be right. I'm not sure that's true, because if that's true, then maybe it's the young and the very old against the middle or something, which again would change things, but then the rest of the analysis would still be right as the age crept around. And that might be right. It might be this coalition of people who think that telling companies what to do is the solution. I find that hard to believe in this context. This is my last paragraph. I find it hard to believe in this context because as soon as they start that, I mean, companies will migrate to other jurisdictions. They'll see rather quickly that you can't just tell 1,000 factories what to do and expect the world to be better. People won't want to open factories in your state or your country. So I don't think that's a long-lived intergenerational bargain. But if you could email me about that too, that would be. Thank you very much.